Bom, primeiramente, bom dia a todos e todas. Hoje a gente está iniciando uma série de webinários pela Associação Data Privacy Brasil de Pesquisa, e junto aqui pela associação a gente tem a Mariana Rielli, que é a nossa líder de projetos, e que daqui a pouco também vai se apresentar e fazer algumas considerações. Então, antes de mais nada, a gente está muito feliz de estar lançando mais uma frente do Observatório da Privacidade e Proteção de Dados Pessoais, que, para quem não conhece, é uma plataforma de monitoramento, de resgate e de projeção do debate e da matéria sobre privacidade e proteção de dados pessoais no Brasil. O nosso primeiro produto entregável foi a memória da Lei Geral de Proteção de Dados Pessoais, onde a gente conta a história de quase uma década de discussão e que, aproveitando também os nossos convidados internacionais, a gente também está anunciando que a gente conseguiu finalmente traduzir para o inglês todos os vídeos, os mais de 150 vídeos, então agora tem legenda em inglês também para que a comunidade internacional possa ter acesso a esse material. E, como todos sabem, a lei vai entrar em vigor em breve, então a gente pensou em organizar essa série de webinários para facilitar a compreensão daquilo que a gente está chamando de temas prioritários, né, para a implementação da Lei Geral de Proteção de Dados. E um desses temas é transferência internacional. Mari, você quer falar um pouquinho mais?
Sim. Bom, pessoal, bom dia. Como o Bruno falou, eu sou a Mariana Rielli, sou líder de projetos no Data Privacy, e o observatório, ele tem alguns objetivos, né? Então, o primeiro objetivo é, de fato, essa questão do resgate de uma memória, de um processo que foi muito rico, um processo multissetorial, que reuniu muitos atores, e, por outro lado, o observatório também tem como objetivo capturar um pouco do debate enquanto ele está acontecendo, né? Então, por isso a gente tem um boletim, que é uma espécie de newsletter quinzenal, e também a gente vai futuramente lançar um projeto específico sobre o legislativo, e agora a gente tem essa série de webinários que pretende, como justamente o Bruno falou, capturar esses temas prioritários, esses temas mais quentes, né, mas às vezes tem mais polêmicas, enfim, alguns temas que a gente considera que na implementação da LGPD vão ser os temas principais. Então, começa com transferência internacional, mas a gente vai discutir questões como direitos das crianças e adolescentes, como dados sensíveis, enfim, uma série de outros temas aí que no futuro, nos próximos meses, a gente vai discutir nesses webinários. Então é isso, de novo agradecer a presença de todo mundo. Bruno, você quer que eu fale um resumo em inglês?
Eu acho que eu posso apresentar brevemente a associação em inglês, e aí você já conecta em inglês e a gente começa com os palestrantes. Pode ser, Mari?
Pode.
Tá. So we have just make an introduction in Portuguese, and I think it's also important just to have an outline of our discussion here in English in order to facilitate also your understanding about the project, what is the role of the association, and so on. So first of all, I think it's important to make clarification, what is Data Privacy Brazil? Data Privacy Brazil is a result of articulation between two different organizations, Data Privacy School, which was founded in 2018, and Data Privacy Research Association, which was founded in 2019. And Data Privacy Research Association, which is carrying on this project, the observatory and the series of webinars, was created to focus only on research and advocacy. So we have an ethical and funding policy, and the association develops strategic research projects in data protection and privacy fields in order to mobilize and help regulators and other watchdogs to deal with complex issues on this topic. And the association, this is an important detail, is a non-profit organization. And this series of webinars is part of a larger project called the Observatory, or Observatório in Portuguese, on privacy and data protection, which was as we previously disclosed, is funded by both Google and Facebook, and which has a twofold goal. On one hand, it aims to retrace and rescue what we call the memory of LGPD, the Brazilian General Data Protection Law, and to present this huge, complex, and process in a friendly and easy way to access. And so in this regard, we made a doc series from a set of 18 interviews with individuals that were in some way very relevant to the process of drafting and passing the law. And we turned these interviews into 150 small videos of up to minutes, and we divided in 5 chapters. And today we are also launching this doc series translated to English, so we are able to conclude English subtitles to this doc series. I think that might be worth for you as well. And the second goal of the observatory is to capture the debates that are happening concerning privacy and data protection right now. So we have also a bi-weekly newsletter where we share news from DPAs, academia, judiciary, and legislative. And we are also building this new project that Mariana is going to present for you.
So we were talking about this new project where we will share the whole landscape of legislative bills on privacy and data protection through the years, like since the 80s. Maybe I think the first one is from 1981, and we will extract a series of analysis and graphs, etc., from this material in order to actually show how this debate on privacy and data protection and regulation has evolved through the years. So this is one of the observatory projects. And the other one is the series of webinars that we are talking about. So we thought that with the coming into force, the entry into force of the LGPD, it would be very interesting to gather people who are specialists, experts, to talk about some of the more complex issues that are the more pressing issues that we think will be very interesting to talk about concerning the LGPD implementation. So this is the series of webinars that today is the first one, and then we will have webinars on the rights of children, on sensitive data, and other topics as well. So this is just the first one. I think that's it. We covered everything, and then we can start with our panelists. So maybe you can, Gabriela, start by talking about your experience with the subject and present yourself, and then we go to the other ones. Thank you.
Thank you, and bom dia. I think I'm going to start, like learning some Portuguese, because there's just so much happening in Brazil, and there are so many exciting things with the LGBT finally and hopefully soon coming into force. Hello, everyone. My name is Gabriela Zanfir Fortuna. I'm a senior counsel for global privacy with the Future of Privacy Forum, which is a think tank based in Washington, D.C. But my background is actually in European Union data protection law. And, we're starting from the question of what's our experience with international data transfers. And I would say I've as an expat, I'm experiencing international data transfers on a daily basis since, living here in the US and communicating all day with my family and friends back in Europe, transferring money and sending all sorts of information and benefiting as an expat from this flux of data that's at the basis of so many online services. So I would say, first of all, I have a very practical experience with international data transfers, and I am a net benefiter from the existence of transfers. But then I also have a lot of experience thinking about why international data transfers have to be secure. Why do they have to ensure that the rights of individuals with respect to their personal data should be respected everywhere where their data goes? And in that capacity of thinking about how data transfer should be secure and safe, I've actually worked on a series of important files when I was back in Brussels, and I was working for the European Data Protection Supervisor. I was part of the international transfer subgroup of the Article 29 Working Party on behalf of the EDPS. Back in 2014 up to 2016, when we actually had a lot of work to do because the EU-US Safe Harbor was just being annulled at that time, in 2015. The negotiations for the Privacy Shield were going on, and the role of the EDPS and the role of the Article 29 Working Party was to make sure that whatever new is put in place should be better and should actually stand the test of the Court of Justice. So I've worked with my colleagues from the Article 29 Working Party on assessing the draft Privacy Shield at that time, and contributed to the opinion, the first opinion from 2016 of the Working Party 29. Then, I was also assessing the EU-US umbrella agreement on behalf of the EDPS. But I suppose my favorite experience with the international data transfers was when I attended, well, that's not really the proper word, but when I was as an agent at the Court of Justice of the European Union, together with the court team of the EDPS, back then Anna Buchta and Roma Robert. And we were actually agents in the case of EU-Canada PNR in front of the Court of Justice. That was a very, very incredible experience for me. And, it also shows that my experience with international data transfers really goes in all directions. And right now, after we had the this judgment of the Court of Justice of the EU on 16th of July, I've been in a frenzy because I am trying to help untangle data transfers between the EU and the US. I'm trying to help everybody understand, well, including myself, the judgment of the Court of Justice, and then trying to see what is there needed to be put in place so that we can secure international data transfers for the future as well. Because as I was saying, I am certainly a net benefiter of data being able to move across borders. So, this is the overall experience. And now I'm actually very interested in seeing how the development of international data transfers will be put in place in Brazil, and how will it actually be put in place in all the countries that have data protection laws, modern data protection laws in place.
Thanks for the the presentation and the introduction of the topic, Gabriela. I will just summarize in Portuguese for our audience. Como vocês perceberam, a Gabriela literalmente esteve envolvida, acho que nas principais, né, discussões sobre transferência internacional envolvendo Estados Unidos e União Europeia. E mais recentemente, acho que vale muito a pena para quem tiver interesse em ler os artigos por ela publicados no Future Price Forum sobre esse último julgamento do Schwings, né, e que também foi objeto de uma outra live que também contou com a presença aqui da Luísa. Eu acho que uma questão que dá para explorar um pouco, que a gente também fará isso na segunda rodada de perguntas, dentro desse cenário, né, onde que o Brasil não tem uma autoridade de proteção de dados pessoais, então é difícil entrar em negociações de acordos de livre fluxo ou pensar na hipótese de adequação. Quais são os outros mecanismos seguros, que foi exatamente essa terminologia que a Gabriela utilizou, que possibilitaria destravar esse livre fluxo internacional ou transfronteiriço, para utilizar uma palavra, uma terminologia da OCDE. E foi isso que foi a grande discussão desse último caso do Max Schrems, onde se discutia se esses instrumentos contratuais, eles davam ou não as salvaguardas necessárias para isso. Então, eu acho que, a partir disso, seria muito legal a gente ouvir o Ralph agora. E aí, porque o Ralph, ele vai se apresentar, ele trabalha na Comissão da União Europeia, e ele está vivendo isso, né, literalmente na pele, essas negociações de acordos de livre fluxo de dados. Ele trabalha na divisão, no departamento específico a esse respeito, junto com o Bruno Giancarelli, e pode também falar um pouquinho desse julgamento. So, Ralph, we are going to move to you. I just highlighted that we are going to have, let's say, a chaotic scenario in Brazil, because we don't have the Brazilian DPA established, so it's quite hard even to start negotiations in terms of adequacy. And also, we don't have someone to nick to the door and say we have some contractual clause, codes of conduct that we are going to ask your help, and please validate for us. So it's even hard to activate the contractual mechanisms for international data transfer. Also, Gabriela has mentioned the judgment, the recent judgment about international data transfer, and we also highlighted that you work in this division department of EU Commission. So please, the floor is yours. Give us an introduction, and please tell us how much fun is working in international data transfers nowadays.
Muito obrigado e bom dia. So that's also as far as my Portuguese goes, although I am calling actually from Portugal, so at least in terms of language I'm close, even if in terms of geographical distance not so much. My name is Ralph Sauer. I'm working with the European Commission, so that's the executive arm, I would say, of the European Union as an international organization, and there I work in the what you would call the Justice Department, or the Ministry of Justice, if you would compare this to a national system, and then within the Justice Department, I'm the deputy head of unit on international data flows and protection, and that unit was created 3-4 years ago, following the completion of the legislative reform in the EU. It was felt that there was now also a need at that point, when at least the internal laws were in place, that there was a need to now also focus more on the external dimension, and in particular on the question how to facilitate data flows on the one hand, but at the same time ensure a high level of data protection. And I think for those that are interested in more broadly what we do, I would refer them to two, you can call them reports. One is the 2017 communication from the European Commission with the title "Exchanging and Protecting Personal Data in a Globalized World." That in a way set out at the beginning when this unit was created, our vision, our work program to some extent. And then more recently, in June of this year, the report on the 2 years of implementation of the GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation, which also has a longer section, especially if you go into the accompanying staff working document. So there's a communication and then there's an accompanying report, if you wish, and that is more detailed, and that has a long section on the international aspects of data protection and what we do and work on. So I would invite those that are interested in these questions to maybe look at these two documents. And as the title of the unit makes clear, we have a double objective. I already referred to that: facilitating data flows on the one hand, but do so with a high level of data protection. And in a way, that is also the objective of EU data protection law more generally. We believe that these two goals can go hand in hand. I'm sure we will have a discussion on the recent judgment and whether it has made that more complicated, or at least one aspect of it, namely facilitating data flows. I don't think so, that this will be the end of this chapter. We believe that these two goals can be squared, but of course it requires some effort, and it requires something which I will also come back to in a minute, namely convergence, I think, at global level as regards data protection rules, but maybe also more convergence as regards the rules regarding government access, so how public authorities can access data. Where we are coming from in the EU, and in that sense, Brazil has the same situation. We're coming from a protection of personal data as a fundamental right, as a constitutional fundamental right, and for us, and this is what the court in particular makes clear in its recent judgments, not just the Schrems judgment, but also others. This implies the continuity of protection. I mean, to ensure that when data leaves the European Union, the protections that we grant to data in the European Union are not undermined. That is important because these data still, even when they have left your territory, your jurisdiction, they still identify you. They can still cause you harm. They can still be used and abused, and it's therefore important not to stop the protections at your border. Otherwise, you have an incomplete system of protection. But of course, that raises difficult questions, jurisdictional questions, and simply practical questions. And I'm sure Bojana and others will also talk about that. So it's certainly not an easy field. I can say that, and in recent times, maybe particularly so, not just because of the Schrems judgment, but also of other things like Brexit and difficult negotiations which we have in certain fields. But it is something which we believe is worthwhile, and that we need to do and are obliged to do under our constitutional system. We have in the GDPR a rather flexible toolbox for data transfers. We don't just have one tool in that box, but we have several instruments with that take a different approach, let's say, to data transfers. Have maybe also partly different functions, partly, although less so after the recent judgment, different standards. So we have an adequacy finding, which is the most comprehensive tool in our toolbox, I would say, because on the basis of an adequacy finding, so a finding by the European Commission, my institution, that a third country ensures a what we call an essentially equivalent, so broadly comparable level of protection to the European Union, data can flow freely and without the need for any further authorization or notification or contracts for data protection. So that is the most comprehensive tool, but it comes with a high standard that we have to meet when coming to such a finding. And so I've been involved in a number of the dialogues, discussions, and to some extent negotiations around adequacy with the United States on the EU-US Privacy Shield, where now the Commission decision has been unfortunately invalidated, and where we will see whether we can replace it with a new and stronger Privacy Shield. I've been involved in the talks with Japan, and I'm currently involved in talks with Korea, but also the United Kingdom, and a few other countries that have expressed an interest in adequacy. I cannot name them all because not all of this, I mean, is public. Some countries ask us to remain confidential about this. And perhaps at some point, and we would be very interested in engaging in that, we could have such a dialogue with Brazil. So that is adequacy, and I will get to the question of government access as part of the assessment in a minute. A second, and in a way the most important tool that we have are the so-called standard contractual clauses. Those are model clauses, and I guess we can come back to that also during the discussion later on. They are model clauses in the sense that they are pre-approved. They have been drawn up by the European Commission. We go through a certain procedure, and then we can give an approval for such clauses, and on that basis, companies can use these clauses to transfer data. And in a way, this is the cheapest and most effective solution in principle, because it's cheap. You can take these clauses from the shelf in a way. You don't need a lawyer to negotiate them with your contractual partner. So they have many advantages, and it's also something that other regions of the world are looking at. For example, ASEAN is also contemplating putting in place this tool, and I could name further countries or regions where this is contemplated. This has been, for transfers from the European Union, made a bit more complicated, and I say this maybe with some understatement, by the recent judgment, and I guess we will discuss this in more detail later on. But in principle, this is we believe, a very effective tool, and we are in the process of modernizing these standard contractual clauses to bring them up to date in a way, to make them more adapted to the modern digital economy, and of course also to certain changes, at least that have come with the adoption of the General Data Protection Regulation. And then there's a couple of other topics that I deal with, and which involve data transfers that can be real data protection agreements. We have, for example, an agreement with the United States, which is called the Umbrella Agreement, or at least we call it that way, which is a framework agreement for data protection in the area of criminal law enforcement. We have at multilateral level, at global level actually, the Council of Europe Convention 108, which I very much hope Brazil will also join in the near future, which is the only international data protection agreement that exists, and where we were very much involved in the negotiations when this convention was recently modernized. Then we have data protection provisions in broader cooperation agreements, for example, in the area of criminal law enforcement. So we are responsible for the data protection safeguards in such agreements. I mentioned maybe just the so-called Cybercrime Convention, it's also called the Budapest Convention, where currently an additional protocol is negotiated, which will expand the investigatory powers that can be used cross-border, but where, of course, we need to ensure that this is accompanied by appropriate data protection safeguards. And we have also set ourselves the goal to develop a kind of framework agreement or arrangement for enforcement cooperation between data protection supervisory authorities. So that's also something we're working on. So there's a range of topics that we look at. And then underlying all this, I would say, and that's in a way the, you could say the upstream work that we are doing is working towards global convergence, trying to push in the direction of convergence of data protection rules around the world, because we believe that's the best way to facilitate data flows, and at the same time, of course, ensure the protection of the data of our citizens. I have already mentioned at global level the Data Protection Convention 108. There are interesting developments at regional level. For example, we were involved in the sense of giving our views and input in the development of the Ibero-American data protection standards for Latin America. There is the African Union Malabo Convention and others. And then there's very interesting developments at national level. Brazil is certainly one of these examples, but also India is developing a data protection law. Kenya has recently developed a data protection law, and I could name many other examples. Latin America is a very interesting region, I think, where a lot of developments, positive developments, are happening. So we're quite happy about that. And we see that a model of a modern data protection regime, which is maybe not identical in the details, but which has a number of common features, is emerging with data protection laws that have horizontal application across all business sectors and maybe also the public sector, that has core principles, rights and obligations ensured, that has rules on international data transfers, and an independent supervisory authority. And I think Brazil is also has gone in this direction, maybe could still go a bit further. Certainly the setting up of the supervisory authority is something we all wait for. And then maybe the extension of the law to other areas that are not yet covered or carved out, like the area of criminal law enforcement. And then the last word, and I'm sure I'm already over my time, way over my time, is government access, which is something which because of the Schrems judgment, we are now particularly focusing on, but we had to focus on this already since the first Schrems judgment from 2015. I think we see more and more that it is important not just to ensure safeguards with respect to what companies do with the data, but also with respect to what governments do with the data, how they access it and use it. And there are clear risks in certain countries. And so I think important work needs to be done at international level to establish common global standards. And this work has actually started, for example, in the OECD, but also the Council of Europe under the Convention 108 that I mentioned is now looking into this, and I think it's a good thing. And there is the Japanese initiative that you might have heard of on data free flow with trust, which was endorsed by the G20 last year, and which also I think has as one direction of ensuring trust to ensure that government access is limited to what is proportionate. So those are that's maybe a broad stroke overview of what we do and focus on, and hopefully gives you a bit of an idea. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ralph. I'm going to summarize what you said in Portuguese now, and then we can proceed to the other panelists. Então, gente, o Ralph faz um panorama bastante amplo de todo o trabalho realizado por ele, pela divisão dele, né, que é a divisão de fluxos transfronteiriços de dados e proteção de dados dentro do Departamento de Justiça, dentro da Comissão da União Europeia, e faz esse overview bastante amplo de todo o trabalho que é realizado e toca em alguns pontos interessantes em relação aos mecanismos especificamente para a transferência internacional de dados, desde decisões de adequação até passando por cláusulas contratuais padrão, mas chegando também em outros mecanismos que não são necessariamente apenas para transferência internacional de dados, mas que tem a ver com transferência internacional de dados em legislações, como legislações referentes a cybercrimes e outras áreas, e eu acho que o que eu acho que é interessante de pontuar, de puxar dessa fala, foi justamente a questão de como a transferência internacional de dados e as regras para a transferência internacional de dados, pelo menos aquelas que têm sido construídas a partir de um modelo da União Europeia, elas partem do pressuposto de que a proteção de dados é um direito fundamental e que quando os dados eles saem de um determinado território, a proteção sobre eles deve permanecer, e é por isso que essas regras existem, para viabilizar que essa transferência ocorra, mas sem perder com isso a proteção de dados. Então, eu acho que, juntando um pouco dessa fala sobre decisão no caso Schrems, sobre mecanismos de transferência internacional, sobre todo esse aparato, e juntando com esse aspecto específico, né, da questão do caráter fundamental da proteção de dados, eu queria passar para a Luísa, que eu acho que tem participado com a gente tem participado com a gente em alguns seminários já, em algumas lives, e falado justamente dessa questão do direito fundamental à proteção de dados, então eu acho que pode ser uma boa ponte para passar para a Luísa, tá bom?
Thank you. Obrigada, Mariana. So I think I just speak in English and then I translate briefly to Portuguese by myself. As Mariana mentioned, I was in a previous webinar about this subject and the decision of the Schrems case. So for those who speak Portuguese, they can go there to see our discussion as well, just in Portuguese. I would like to thank you for the invitation. It's very nice to see everybody engaged on these topics. We for sure have a lot of challenges in our scenario. Brazil is quite a challenging place, and when we are talking about institutional design, and we face this with our DPA as well. So as Bruno mentioned, I'm Luisa. I'm from the Institute for Research on Internet and Society, also a non-profit organization dedicated to research in Brazil. We deal with internet governance subjects and other interdisciplinary subjects around how internet has impacted our societies, our laws, and our lives. As Mariana mentioned, we are especially dedicated to digital rights, and we see data protection as a digital right, as a fundamental right from our era. So, being said, my background and how we work at the Institute, I have also to say that my personal background, as Gabriela said, also benefits a lot from international data flow. And an example of this is that we are able to discuss a global topic with people in different countries right now, and we can exchange ideas. And this shows how the global nature of internet and how it works should be maintained. So a major point for us of study is how to keep the global nature of data flows and how to keep the communication system in a global perspective. That's why I'm also dedicated to internet and jurisdiction fields. This is why my research, this is where my research came from. So I've been dealing with conflicts of law, international cooperation processes, and law enforcement process in a transnational perspective. These are quite challenging issues, especially because, as Rolf mentioned, there is a lack of convergence that we need to fulfill, and we have some initiatives to look for or to try to find some harmonization, but we still have a lot of divergence between countries and their internal laws. How do we put this together is definitely a question that we have to work on. And when we think about the ruling, I think we will discuss it further, but the Schrems ruling, the most recent one, we also have this sign for international relations, for international law, that we should take in consideration how our internal law, for example, the Brazilian law or the Brazilian initiatives for changing the law, because we have a lot of them. We could spend hours and hours talking about recent initiatives that aims to have more data for public authorities. And so we have a big range of initiatives that we should think more carefully how these initiatives will proceed or will work in the future when we think about international data flow, which is important also to mention that an eventual adequacy decision for Brazil doesn't mean an adequacy decision forever. If we change our grantees, if we change the way we access data, if we do not fulfill the agreements Brazil have already signed, this could have huge impacts on an eventual adequacy decision. So this is my point of view, the place from I look at the questions. We work with advocacy as well. So a lot of these initiatives and the contact with law enforcement forces in Brazil take me to a very worried place about future data flow in Brazil. That's it, I think, for beginning. And now I will switch to Portuguese just quickly. Então, como eu estava falando, eu acho super interessante a iniciativa do Data Privacy de trazer esses tópicos, né? A gente está num momento super desafiador institucionalmente no Brasil, então isso inclui a nossa Autoridade de Proteção de Dados, né? E a sua concretização. Eu também falei um pouco do meu background de direito internacional, relações internacionais, que foi refletido muito na última live sobre o caso de Schrems, daí quem quiser pode dar uma olhadinha lá. E também disse um pouco do contato que a gente faz no IRIS, né, o Instituto de Referência Internet e Sociedade, com os temas de internet e jurisdição, transferência internacional de dados, cooperação jurídica internacional e a preocupação com a proteção de dados como um direito fundamental, um direito a ser protegido na nossa era. Eu acho que foi mais ou menos isso que eu falei. Também chamei a atenção um pouco para as iniciativas que nesse contato, né, inclusive do IRIS, com autoridades, com outras iniciativas legislativas, elas são preocupantes do ponto de vista de quais serão as suas consequências para uma futura decisão de adequação do Brasil, se ela acontecer, e mesmo que ela aconteça, se alguma iniciativa mudar o sistema de proteção de dados no Brasil ou tornar mais ampla o acesso a dados, isso poderia prejudicar, então, o nosso fluxo internacional de dados. Não sei se eu deixei escapar alguma coisa, porque a gente vai falando assim no fluxo, mas Bruno, Mariana, sintam-se à vontade para complementar. And thanks for asking.
Foi ótimo, Luísa. Foi ótimo, Luísa, como sempre. Bom, a gente, enfim, acho que a gente tem muitos achados aqui, né? Então, o próprio Ralph deu uma visão muito bem sistematizada, esquematizada de como que funcionam os mecanismos de transferência internacional, inclusive ressaltando a importância e o papel da Convenção Internacional 108, e também dizendo que isso encontra reflexo em outros fóruns, como, por exemplo, a própria OCDE, né, a Organização para a Cooperação e Desenvolvimento Socioeconômico, que tem trabalhado, atualizado, desde 2013, com o Privacy Framework, com um eixo muito focado em livre fluxo transfronteiriço de dados. Eu acho que é daí que a gente pode conectar com a Boiana. Boiana, I was just describing how much worth is being this webinar. Half could give us a broad overview about the whole international data transfer landscape, and point out the importance that we have a kind of toolbox that facilitates international data transfer. And we can also see this in the Brazilian data protection law. It's also based on this kind of international data transfer toolbox. And as you know, the core elements for to grant this kind of confidence, trust in the data processor and data controllers is based on accountability, which is one of your favorite talks. So if you could explain how works this toolbox, and bearing in mind that the core element is accountability, what are the procedures? And I'm sure that CIPO is working on that, and you can give us a kind of concrete examples.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you, Bruno, very much. And thank you for gathering us together and with great friends and panelists here. I'm delighted to work with you as well. Of course, as you know, we at CIPL have launched a project on implementation of LGPD with a number of multi-stakeholder experts. And Bruno, you sit on our advisory committee for this as well. So it really is congratulations for the work that you do as well within the observatory. I think it's very important. And I think the topic of transborder data flows is incredibly important as well. So a little bit personal story. I have been doing privacy for about 25 years, for a very long time. And data flows was the first legal challenge I was given in my consulting work. I had to advise an organization, global organization, on how are they going to be implementing their data flows in compliance with then directive and growing body of law. And look, 25 years later, we are still talking about data flows, right? We haven't solved that problem. In fact, it's a bigger problem. It's more important problem to solve and to tackle. And this is another little anecdote that even Ralph doesn't know. I actually worked as one of the contractors for the EU Commission many years ago on the adequacy of Argentina, on these assessments. So you see, so many years ago, we were working on that. And now, again, we are doing these adequacy assessments in a very different way. So it is important to talk about this because it is not solved legally. It is not solved from policy perspective. And I can tell you, I work with global organizations, and this is one of 3 top compliance priorities for every organization. Trust me, even if you think you're a Brazilian company, you will be transferring data because you might be using some of the technology, such as cloud technology or calling technology or email technology that actually is making your data be global and go global, not to mention other service providers that you may be interacting with. So my first point, I want to kind of make several points, if I can, in my introduction. The first point is to really realize that data flows are an absolute feature of the world we live in, and this fourth industrial revolution and digital revolution that we are living, even in the post-COVID world where people talk about globalization is dead, actually that's not true when it comes to data flows. Data flows are more important than ever. They're going to be more important even to fight this pandemic. They're going to be important to ensure economic recovery. They're going to be important to ensure, frankly, competitiveness and access to data and markets and AI, R&D, and other technology, right? So it is absolutely important that we, policymakers and lawmakers, take that into account, right? We have to create laws and implement and interpret laws in the way that they enable data flows and ensure this economic potential of data flows, but in the way that protects privacy and in a way that accountability and protection flows with that data. And that is not easy. And I do want to remind people about some of the really numbers and research done by, phenomenal organizations like McKinsey's and World Bank. McKinsey in 2016, a research paper which is very influential in data flows, has sort of said that the data flows, that the flows of data are in fact increasing, and that trend is going to continue. In 2019, they've confirmed that in the new survey. And in fact, trade in goods and service goods is going down, but really data flows are mushrooming. And the impact on GDP of having those data flows is absolutely critical for the economy, right? 10% increase in world GDP and up to 50% potential increase in GDP in emerging markets. And there was even data on Brazil, which kind of gave some crazy numbers that would have accelerated the Brazilian economy tenfold in this period, right, to 2016. So we really have to kind of look at these numbers as well. The second thing about the surveys is that they kind of keep showing that data flows is not just prerequisite of big companies and big multinationals. I work with lots of big multinationals, but actually, data flows are beneficial for people, all of us. And you all talked how we benefit of data flows because we learn, we work, we communicate, we live, we pray these days and have relationships across borders and kind of with data flows as well. And startups, you will be surprised, but 86% of startups are born global, right? Not in Brazil, not in UK or Germany. They're actually born global because they use technology, supply chain, people, skills, or simply software that is actually cross-border, right? International. So it implies data flows. And it is absolutely critical for SMEs as well to enable this data flow. So, forgive me for going on about this economic imperative of data flow, but it's incredibly important to know this, right? And that's why the World Bank is talking about these numbers as well. And that's why every government today cannot absolutely ignore this topic, right? And that's why it gets very complicated when you have now data protection laws, which is all about protecting people's data. And my point is that we can't look at data protection laws in vacuum, right? They're not only there to protect people and people's data, they work in the context of an economic world and today economic regrowth that we have to live in. So they do have a dual role, and we have to enable and interpret these rules and requirements to ensure that these responsible data flows continue to go ahead. And I fear, when we see calls for data localization in a number of countries. If you remember, we went through that in Brazil. Luckily, that has passed, that trend has passed, but I think there is this growing trend again, and some people, Ralph, may interpret Schrem's decision and they may react to Schrem's decision with their own data localization requirements, which would be tragic because we know that Commission, in fact, has been very vocal in fighting data localization, and the 2017 document that you mentioned really set a very progressive and future-thinking policy of the EU Commission on how we can build the convergence, how we can build that interoperability with the rest of the world, and how we can actually quash data localization. So I worry about data localization trend, to be frank with you, because I think it is misplaced, yet it is on the rise in some of the economies. And I do hope that Brazil will stay very clear of that. And again, some really interesting data by the European Center for Internet Policy and Economy in Brussels. They're really talking about negative impact of data localization that is reducing GDP, that is actually resulting in declining investment, and finally it's raising cost of access to key business technologies. And there I say it's actually also rendering economy and companies and countries less competitive because they cannot access the scale of data and the technology, such as AI technology, which is required now to stay competitive, right? And it's counterintuitive because some countries are saying we want to keep data in our country so that we can actually manipulate data through AI, but actually it doesn't work like that because you need scale of data, you need exchanges of data. So incredibly important for all policymakers, and particularly for data protection regulators who are there to implement and enforce data protection law, to kind of understand that bigger picture of data flows and the importance of data for really economy, but society benefits as well. And Bruno, I told you, we just got off a webinar which we hosted with Hong Kong University for sort of Asian privacy commissioners, all around use of data for social impact and social good. There's this huge push after COVID to do more, right? For organizations and researchers to be able to use data. So how do we do that? And that these data flows, researchers have told us they need globally shareable platforms to be able to exchange all of this data. But let's come back to Brazilian data protection law. That's my sort of third point in the intro. So as you have all said, LGPD was very much inspired by the GDPR when it came to the provisions on international data flows, but I think it's also gone beyond somewhat. And there I say, CIPL and many others have been really instrumental in shaping the LGPD to ensure as much as possible broad spectrum of data flow mechanisms to fit all these different cases of data flows, right? Controller to processor, processor to processor, controller to controller, sharing of data with government, with private sector, multiple situations, and I am encouraged by what I see in LGPD, because I think that's a great standing platform to actually build the proper data protection regime, not to be too prescriptive, not to be too bureaucratic, because honestly, I think prescription and bureaucracy is an enemy of responsible data flows. And I dare say in Europe, I think we might have now swung the pendulum a little bit too much towards that bureaucracy and prescription, and forgotten the spirit that we used to have as well in the directive, in GDPR as well. But we can talk about that further. So what needs to happen in Brazil now is that as I say, we have got that broad spectrum of mechanisms, but we need AMPD, yes? We need the Data Protection Authority to be able to interpret, provide the guidelines, and really make operational these provisions on data flows. And of course, the agency isn't in position yet, has not been appointed yet. So we are in this really difficult vacuum now and legal uncertainty. And yes, Observatory and Bruno, you are doing great work. I mean, we at CIPL also are publishing about priorities on LGPD compliance as part of our project as well. But, not everybody has got access to all of these resources, and every organization is going to need some input and some advice as to how to structure their data flows. So AMPD, as you know, will have a duty to work on the adequacy findings with other third countries, which will take time, but that will be done probably at some point. They're also tasked by the lawmaker to create standard contractual clauses. We very much hope they will be similar to what we have in Europe, as opposed to something, again, totally different, right? Or to work on ad hoc clauses, as well as certifications and codes of conduct as mechanisms for data transfers. But you see, none of this exists until they actually create this. So with the vacuum and the lack of IMPD, we are in a bit of a difficult situation at the moment. So I hope that once the IMPD is operational, that this will be really the top priority of the IMPD. And as you know, we have published the paper on the Data Protection Authority and their statutory roles and what their priorities should be. And this should be the work that must be done immediately. And I hope that in doing this, they will they will encourage convergence, bridge building, interoperability with other systems, and they will learn from best practices out there, but also perhaps mistakes or perhaps going too far in some ways as well. And that's really what we would like the IMPD to do, to again enable this broad spectrum of mechanisms, including, by the way, binding corporate rules. I have forgotten to mention that, very important, because organizations that operate globally, they want to actually use a single mechanism to ensure compliance in multiple jurisdictions. And at the moment, there is such a variety, really, of approaches that it's becoming very, very difficult. And we at CIPL have actually written a paper in 2017, latest update on these different mechanisms of global data flows and how every law should actually allow for all of these to cherish and flourish without prescripting exactly how they will look like, because that enables us to future-proof these mechanisms for the future as well. I also think that they should be inspired by growing body of certifications. I think we have got, we are waiting for GDPR certifications, and I hope this comes, but it's a complicated process under GDPR, and that's why it's taking a very long time. But we have got other certifications. There are ISO certifications, which are really interesting at the moment. There are cross-border privacy rules, and I hear that might be open now to non-APAC economies as well, and they will be improving. There is NIST frameworks, and of course, OECD is working very much also, as others have mentioned, on this whole topic of data flows in the context of governmental access to data and, of course, data localization, right? And I think Brazil has got big aspirations to join OECD, or has joined OECD already, and therefore will have to be an important player in these discussions as well. Now, the final point is about the companies. Look, as I say, every company is spending huge amounts of time and effort on ensuring compliance with data flow provisions of course, GDPR, because that is the most complex, the most mature, but of course, all the other laws which are sort of copying GDPR, but not quite, or perhaps going another way. And really, it is becoming very difficult to ensure that in every country you have got a particular model contract that actually fits your national jurisdiction. So we really need to work on the convergence of these data transfer mechanisms, and we have to be bold and brave. And I know it's not easy to do that, particularly after the Schrems decision, which has raised the bar of international data transfers for Europe. But the rest of the world doesn't need to go and copy quite Schrems 2 decision, right? We've copied the GDPR, we've got great toolbox, and I think we now have to start working with that toolbox. Binding corporate rules is an incredibly important mechanism for data transfers in the same group of companies. But let me say this as well. If I'm a binding corporate rule certified company, and Company X is also has got binding corporate rules, why can't we exchange data? In fact, that's possible under GDPR if they're in the joint activity. So we need to work on these, future. We need to evolve all of these data transfer mechanisms. And why not also recognize, for example, Japanese privacy mark or APAC cross-border privacy rule as a good enough certification, or even ISO certification as a good enough certification at the recipient level, as in when we are transferring data from Brazil to another country. So I know this is difficult. I know it takes time to think these concepts through, but we do need that courage. And we do need the Data Protection Authority that is ready to work with their counterparts and with international organizations to work on this. Because really, businesses, trust me, do not want to spend bureaucratic time and money and legal time and fees on solving legal issues of data flows. They want to ensure there is adequate and appropriate privacy protection as when they're delivering their products, as well as when they're sharing data. So the money and resources should be moved towards compliance and accountability, right? As opposed to legalizing and paperworking data flows. So whatever we can do as international community, as data protection regulators, as policymakers to create those bridges so that organizations of all sizes can move more seamlessly and really focus on protecting data, people, and enabling responsible use of data through accountability, I think that's really the best place to be. So I'll stop there. And very happy to cover lots of these details in further questions and discussions.
Thank you so much, Boiana. Moving to Portuguese, just to summarize. Enfim, a gente agora percebe o quão difícil é um trabalho de um tradutor, né? Ainda mais quando é sincronizado, que não é o caso aqui, o que já facilita. Bom, mas acho que a Boiana, primeiro, antes de mais nada, como já está aí no chat, tem um projeto muito legal entre o CIPL e o IDP de Brasília, onde que eles já lançaram 2 papers, que inclusive foram pontos de destaque na nossa última newsletter, um sobre prioridades da DPA brasileira, da ANPD, e um outro sobre também questões de implementação da LGPD. Então, fica aqui um material de pesquisa, de futuro estudo, de recursos, para utilizar a palavra e o termo que a Boiana usou. Aí a Boiana chegou a falar também da questão que toca muito em termos de convergência de proteção de dados pessoais, que é uma onda de obrigações de localização de datas ou data localization. É importante contextuar o pessoal que está assistindo a live que essa não é uma discussão nova no Brasil. Ela foi, inclusive, uma discussão que foi rechaçada na época que a gente estava discutindo o Marco Civil da Internet, mas, como foi bem pontuado, vira e mexe, volta à tona. E uma questão que é importante em termos de reflexão que se coloca por si só, o armazenamento, aquela ideia de trancafiar os dados fisicamente num local, isso levanta a régua de salvaguardas ou de você ter os dados tratados, processados de maneira mais segura? É uma das reflexões que a Boiana colocou, não necessariamente, né? E uma outra questão que também foi pontuada por ela, que eu acho que vale muito projetar para o futuro, é que a lei brasileira, sim, tem uma caixa de ferramentas interessantíssima de ser trabalhada para facilitar e não ter mecanismos muito burocráticos ou muito prescritivos, onde que isso facilitaria esse livre fluxo. Agora, o tom dessa burocracia ou do quanto isso vai ser prescritivo depende muito de como que a autoridade vai normatizar isso lá na frente. E foi por isso que, num dos papers lançados pelo IDP com o CIPL, se coloca isso como uma das prioridades, enfim, primeiras. Quem tiver na NPD vai estar literalmente correndo contra o relógio, que seria justamente se debruçar sobre esses mecanismos, né? E aí é uma coisa que a Boiana também tocou, que é um dos principais mecanismos que também está previsto na LGPD e na GDPR, são as BCRs, as Binding Corporate Rules, ou as normas corporativas globais, que reconhece uma organização, um grupo econômico, quase como se ele tivesse um nível adequado de proteção de dados e você pudesse ter esse livre fluxo informacional intra-organizacional. Mas, de novo, isso custa muito, isso tem um trabalho muito de legal, entre outras coisas, então, realmente, uma coisa que o Ralph tocou anteriormente, o melhor cenário seria a gente pensar numa decisão de adequacy, porque aí você cria uma avenida aberta e isso deixa de ser uma barreira de entrada, principalmente para startups, entre outras coisas. E isso conversa muito com a fala da Boiana, no sentido de que essa é uma discussão, sobretudo, de política de governo, política de Estado, e o governo brasileiro, seja qual administração for, tem que colocar isso em cima da mesa, porque é uma questão, sobretudo, da própria economia brasileira. Então, acho que é mais ou menos isso que a gente poderia sumarizar e sintetizar da fala da Boiana. E aí a gente vai para o Renato. Renato, e aqui acho que também, enfim, como você já advogou por muito tempo, você tem uma perspectiva tanto de pequenas empresas até grandes empresas, hoje na posição que você atua no Twitter, falar de quais são os desafios realmente brasileiros, depois de toda essa visão internacional e assim por diante. Tem uma pergunta do Cláudio, que inclusive acho que dá para você eventualmente já endereçar, que dentro desse cenário de não instalação da NPD, se seria o caso de a gente usar a régua mais alta, como, por exemplo, da GDPR.
Okay, so I'll start with English, and then I'll translate a little bit of it afterwards. So first, I want to thank you here for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here among such brilliant minds. I can say that we admire, and we have the opportunity to engage with, and in colleagues here. So Bruno, Luisa, Mariana, Ralph, Bohana, Gabriela, on this very topic to be discussing right now at this moment, as we are on this adventure that we call LGPD. Let's say that. So right now, as Bruno mentioned, right now I am the Data Protection Council lead for Latin America on Twitter, but I've been working on data protection issues for the last 10 years. And I'm really proud to say I can say, that I had the opportunity to provide some help and to engage into discussions on that led to LGPD together with Bruno, together with Luisa, and we had the opportunity to discuss some of these issues. But prior to joining Twitter, so before mentioning the experience of being a law firm, it was funny because Bohana mentioned that most of the startups, they are born global right now, and I do remember that the time that I was studying in Singapore, and I was studying data protection, and one of the issues that I was studying was the government responses to Snowden revelations. And because of that, I had like this very, very tiny research position, a startup in Malaysia that I was helping from Singapore. And because of that, I had the opportunity to work a little bit on APAC privacy framework and all the data flow mechanisms for that. And so it was a really tiny startup, and like they were like about 5 people, and it was born international. And a movie came to my mind, so everything that came after that. So after that, I went to as a study visa at the Data Protection Department of the Council of Europe to work with Sophie Kwasny, that I know that is watching us. Like me and Gabriela, we were just sending her a message over Twitter here. And over there, like I had the opportunity to work on the early movements to the modernization of Convention 108. What I want to highlight here is still the most international comprehensive data protection framework that we can have, that is open for countries that are not parts of the Council of Europe to be a part of. And I hope, as Bohana mentioned, I hope that Brazil, and also Ralph mentioned that Brazil not only accepts the Convention 108, but relies, for example, on recital 105 of the GDPR in order to have its adequacy position. That makes it a little bit easier, that we know that it's not an easy task. So after that, I went to coordinate in a law firm in Brazil. So the compliance efforts with LGPD, and a little bit with GDPR, and a little bit with CCPA also. And I know it's not easy at all. And it's not easy because every single movement that we were about to do when it comes to LGPD was, are we correct? Do we know what we are about to do? Is there something that we're gonna do now, and maybe in a 6 months time or 1 year time, we're gonna have to do it again? Should we wait? Should we like go in a risk-based approach and do what we do right now and wait for them? The law is gonna be in fact, we don't know when, now we know. probably next week, the law is going to come into effect. What do we know? Do we just copy what we do in the GDPR? We take, like, for example, SEC. So we rely on SEC. If we are a company that relies on SEC for international data transfer from the EU to other countries, can we rely on that? So we use SECs, and we used to rely on privacy shields. Can we do that? Or can we just, like in Brazil, rely on consent as one of the things that we still listen to a lot? And I see Bohan, I'm nodding her head. Yes. So because there was, I guess, some of the main difficulties that I see some companies, that I used to see some companies in Brazil when I was helping them on compliance efforts at the law firm, is that they're still learning the basics when it comes to data protection. When they see some issues, that when you go to Article 33 of the LGPD, which has all the legal instruments for international transfers, and when we provide ideas of standard contractual clauses, binding corporate rules, adequacy decision, they really don't know what that is, and they go with the concepts they are already familiar with. So consent is one. Contractual necessity is one. We can talk a little bit about that after. So should we do that? So I do remember a case that we were dealing with a company from the EU. It was a company from the UK, and they were trying to close a deal with a company in Brazil, and they say, okay, so it's the basic structure of the deal, it demands international data flows, a big amount of international data flows. How are we going to do that? And my answer for them was, I guess, as Bruno said, we can raise the bar. We can provide as many accountability instruments as possible to show authorities, not only ANPD when ANPD is established, but also other authorities that can ask some of the things. Probably a lot of the folks that are watching us know that ANPD is only one of the enforcement authorities that we're going to have in Brazil, and can enforce on some of these issues. So my answer for them was, so let's develop all of the legal instruments that we can have, so accountability, and we're gonna go in a risk-based approach, that we're gonna either rely on something, a structure similar to standard contractual clauses, or binding corporate rules, or contractual necessity, and other ones, in order to enable these data flows. And I do remember that, and this case was particularly interesting for me, that the company said, no, we are not gonna do that. And the reason why we're not going to do that is that we do agree with all the advice that you're providing, but our boards, for them, is really a risky situation to provide these data flows without the guidance of the national authorities. So how are we going to do that? And that had a really big impact on this deal. And I go a little bit of what Bohana mentioned, that international data flows are key for market access, are key for competition, are key for innovation. And I would to highlight some issues that might come into impact in Brazil, that not only we are talking about OECD that Brazil wants to enter, but Brazil is also, together with Mercosur, is discussing an international trade agreement with the EU. So we know some of us maybe have followed what was the struggle that there was to negotiate the international agreement between EU and Japan, and how data protection played an important role to enable that, and how will that come into Brazil. So that's one of the issues that I saw when I was at the law firm. But now when I joined Twitter, and we are a company we only exist because of international data flows. So we are in the entire world, and Brazil is one of our biggest markets. And right now I am coordinating all the compliance efforts with LGPD that started a long time ago, and now we are putting in place everything that we need to do. And some of the issues that we are coming, they are say, okay, so first, for the EU and the US, we rely on SCCs, and we used to rely on the privacy shield. So what are we gonna do now? So right now, for example, we are drafting some of the legal terms of our data processing addendas and our data processing agreements that we have with our vendors. Also that we have going to do on our privacy policies, controller to controller, controller to processor, and so on. But also there are some technical aspects of LGPD or Article 33 that are not very clear to us. And we need, for example, ANPD's guidance for that. For example, the data, who is going to be the data controller for the data? It's going to be the Brazilian entity. It's going to be the US entity. So it's going to be really like international data transfer if we are saying that the data is transferred from the user for the citizen, for a Brazilian person that is located in Brazil, and then you have the structure of the internet to transfer the data for the entity which is not in Brazil. So is that international data flow for the aspects of LGPD? Because LGPD, because on GDPR, it's clear that international data transfer is controller to controller, controller to processor. And now we are saying that it's data that goes from Brazil to a company that is not located in Brazil. Is that for LGPD considering international data flows? If we go through flow of data idea concept that we have in our minds, of course it is, because the data is going to leave our country. But that goes for the regulatory aspects, we do not know. So that's one of the issues that we are not only, I guess, the industry and everyone is asking ourselves. So one of the issues that maybe we could approach that in Bruno's afterwards is that one of the other provisions that we have on Article 33 is contractual necessity. So we don't need to rely on the SCCs, binding corporate rules, or adequacy decision, and so on. If we have a contract in place, and in order to provide those services, we need, it is mandatory, it is a necessity to international transfer abroad. So, but that becomes that with a strange approach that we have been seeing in Brazil, that is not the contract itself. So what we see from the compliance efforts is that companies say, okay, we have a contract, and that's it. Because to fulfill that contract, we need to transfer data abroad. But they forget the principles such as the necessity principle, data minimization principle that we also have on the LGBT, and how that goes with the contractual necessity, and how we can apply for that for Article 33. We also do not have a guidance on that. So just to finalize, Bruno, is that from what I have seen from the last 2.5 years that I've been, almost 3 years that I'm providing some counseling companies in Brazil and outside of Brazil, and also Twitter in Brazil and Latin America, is that either we rely on a risk-based approach and accountability, very, very strong accountability measures, or we're gonna be here in a situation that either we continue the way it is, or we go in a shutdown. And I don't think shutdown is an option for anyone. So we do need to develop these very, very strong accountability measures in order to enable these data flows. And maybe, and I guess this is an idea that I have been trying to put upon, is that if we do some of the things we want to do right now, and we get all of the initiatives such as this one from Data Privacy Brazil Research and what CIPO and Future Pricing Forum is doing, we can help ANPD to develop the instruments that are necessary in order to enforce LGPD the way it should be enforced. Bruno, você quer que eu traduza aqui algumas partes? Okay, so I'm gonna switch. Sorry, Gabriela. I know that you know a little bit of Portuguese because of your backgrounds, but let's read a little bit Portuguese here. Então, o pessoal que está assistindo, de uma forma bem rápida, até para a gente poder passar para o pessoal, falando assim, que algumas das dificuldades que as organizações hoje têm encontrado no Brasil, nos seus esforços de adequação com a LGPD, é exatamente, primeiro, ainda entender alguns conceitos básicos da LGPD. Será que eu posso, por exemplo, para a transferência internacional, me basear num consentimento e o risco que tudo isso traz, simplesmente porque o consentimento é uma das opções que está prevista no artigo 33? Ou se eu posso me basear, por exemplo, numa execução de contrato, né? Então, necessidade contratual. Mas sabendo que quando a gente fala da base legal de execução do contrato, não é simplesmente ter um contrato entre as partes e eu vou simplesmente transferir dados internacional. A gente tem que ler essa base legal de execução de contrato com os princípios previstos no artigo 6º, principalmente aqui o princípio da necessidade, que diz que não é qualquer tipo de dado, simplesmente eu coloco lá que no objeto do contrato, por exemplo, armazenamento em nuvem, e eu preciso, para poder fazer isso, para poder o meu serviço ficar em pé, eu tenho que armazenar na nuvem que está fora do Brasil. Então, são algumas das questões que a gente está discutindo. E enquanto a gente não tem uma NPD para ou dar uma decisão de adequação, ou ter cláusulas contratuais padrão, ou ter cláusulas corporativas globais, toda a orientação que tem isso, o que é que as empresas podem fazer, o que é que elas têm feito, na verdade. Então, na verdade, aqui, o que muitas empresas têm feito, principalmente aquelas que têm experiência fora do Brasil, desenvolver elementos e instrumentos fortes de accountability, prestação de contas, com base na sua própria experiência, com base nas discussões dentro do mercado, em que os players discutem entre si, para que até mesmo os players possam ter uma proteção que seja tão robusta que possa até ajudar a NPD no momento que a NPD for discutir o desenvolvimento desses instrumentos. E é muito bom, seria muito importante ter aqui um alinhamento de indústria de internet, indústria de saúde, indústria automobilística, a academia, para poder ter as particularidades que se aplicam aos seus representantes e levar isso para a NPD quando ela existir. A gente não pode hoje simplesmente deixar de transferir dados internacional, porque senão muitos dos modelos de negócio das empresas vão parar suas operações e essa não é uma opção e nem é um objetivo da LGPD. Então, que a gente, levando tudo isso, talvez num approach de risco, nossa lei ela é baseada no risco, possa continuar até que a NPD esteja aí à frente e possa nos dar as orientações e os guidelines ideais nesse momento.
Muito obrigada, Renato. Acho que todos os participantes deram, a partir das suas experiências pessoais e profissionais, deram um panorama bastante amplo, né, bastante compreensivo da questão. Nós temos cerca de meia hora para continuar discutindo, e a gente tem algumas perguntas específicas que a gente tinha feito para cada um de vocês. Então, eu vou começar com a Gabriela, porque ela foi a primeira a falar, né, na apresentação, e aí, mas a pergunta que a gente fez para ela, na verdade, é uma pergunta bastante geral. Então, se vocês também tiverem colocações a fazer a respeito disso, eu acho que não vejo problema em ter algum tipo de colocação, interrupção, porque pode deixar o debate mais fluido. So I was just saying that we have about half an hour to go, and we have some very specific questions that we had thought to ask each one of you. And the first one is for Gabriela, but I was saying that it's a very general question that we are asking. So if Boiana, Ralph, Luisa, Renato, if you want to engage maybe and say something about this as well, it's not a problem. So the question is, let me just... Considering the absence of both an adequacy decision and an independent data protection authority in Brazil, what data controllers and data processors based in Brazil can learn from the international experience with regards to transborder data flow? So a pretty general question and something that has been kind of addressed already, but maybe if you could say some words about it would be great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mariana. And I echo what Boiana was saying earlier, that once the Data Protection Authority is set in place, international data transfers should be the top priority, or at least in top 3, because I know that there is a lot of work to do. And I would say that, Brazil is not the only country that does not have an adequacy decision or an independent data protection authority. So then there's a lot to learn, for example, from the US, which does not have an independent data protection authority and does not have an adequacy decision. And at one point, I was actually saying that perhaps the US is actually the only country in the world that has an inadequacy decision now with the judgment in Schrems 2. So, and data flows are still happening between the EU and the US. So what's, I'm actually wondering whether you're considering with this question the situation of a transfer between Europe and Brazil, or generally, transfers between Brazil and the entire world?
We're thinking both, actually. So maybe generally would be best to we covers the UE.
So yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Bruno.
No, please, just add some more comments.
Yeah, so if we're talking about Brazil and Europe, then, things, there are certainly mechanisms that allow transfers. But if we're talking about transfers from Brazil to the rest of the world, things are very complicated because you don't really have legal certainty. So it's very difficult to put a framework in place. You have no guidelines from the enforcer of the LGPD. So the best you could do is really prepare plans A, B, and C, just like Renato was saying, and analyzing exactly Chapter 5 of the LGPD and look at what are your options. You also have options that are very much under your control to a certain extent. You have the option of the binding corporate rules. You can prepare for that for the first day when the DPA will be set in place. Look at the other options that are in Chapter 5 and try to make a plan for each. I'm also curious in terms of process, actually. I know that LGPD provides for adequacy as well as one of the possibilities for transfers. But I believe, is it the DPA that actually has to issue an adequacy decision? Is that right? Did I read that right? Because that's also very interesting. Like the DPA will need to have a lot of capacity to be able to do that. And Ralph knows very well how much work and how much effort it takes to assess how foreign legal system works in relation to data. So I wouldn't put all of my eggs into the basket of adequacy after the LGPD becomes applicable, because I think there's a lot of effort that goes into an adequacy assessment. So yeah, those are just a couple of remarks about this.
We are a little bit restricted in terms of time, so I'm going to move directly to Ralph and ask two questions, basically. You have mentioned that one of the common understanding regarding data protection between EU and Brazil is this approach based on fundamental rights. And recently, we had a really important decision from our Supreme Court that recognized data protection as a fundamental and an autonomous right. So the first question it would be this let's say counts in terms of convergency, and the second, it's a more like a concrete questions and which connects with the shrinks case too. So if you could talk a little bit about the use of standard contractual clause and just contractual clause and how they enable international data transfer of data from EU countries to non-EU countries, and what are the main differences that occur when the transfer involves only controllers and when it involves processors.
Yeah, thank you for the question. On what you said first on the fundamental rights issue, I was aware of this judgment, and I'm quite happy about it. I think it's a good thing because if you have data protection protected as a fundamental right, I think this of course also has an influence how legislation is designed and then interpreted, and I think certainly from a perspective of the protection of individuals, that is a good thing. I presume the Constitution also protects other interests, including maybe business interest, and so of course, as always, fundamental rights protection does not mean absolute protection. Also, data protection in the EU is not an absolute right. It allows for the balancing with other interests, but it gives it a certain weight, and I think that is quite important. On your question, and it also relates to what other speakers have said about transfer rules in Brazil. I mean, I very much believe that indeed standard contractual clauses, you don't have to call them that way, model clauses with data protection safeguards, that is what we're talking about, is a very important tool. In my view, actually, probably the best tool to bridge the differences in the legislation of different countries, because I think, I mean, the way these clauses work is basically someone in the EU, this is the Commission, draws up these clauses with the. That's not the full GDPR, obviously. In EU law, it's what we call appropriate safeguards. It's a sub section, let's say, of the GDPR, like the most important principles, rights, and obligations form part of these model clauses, and they will then become binding when they become part of a contract between two commercial operators. Whether they make them binding that's voluntary, but once they agree to them, they are bound by them, and they that's very important. They create what we call third-party beneficiary rights, but it's a big term, which is much easier to just say. They create rights for individuals. So for those individuals whose personal data will then be transferred on the basis of these clauses. And then you have to have some mechanism for enforcement, and there will of course be the possibility for private enforcement, in the sense that the two commercial partners, as always with respect to a contract that they conclude, can enforce these clauses, but also individuals. That's why there are these third-party beneficiary rights can invoke and enforce in court if necessary, and those safeguards that are meant to protect them. And of course, there have to be rules about which court, in which jurisdiction, and it makes some sense to link that to the jurisdiction of the exporter, but because that's usually where the data has been collected. I mean, it should be close to the individual if it's about the exercise of rights. And then there should be something about oversight and enforcement by a supervisory authority. And again, there's the question where that authority is located. but it's the way it works in the EU standard contractual clauses is that typically the data importer has to submit itself to the jurisdiction of the supervisory authority of the data exporter. So that's the way this works. It creates a clear legal framework which is independent of the data protection rules in the country of destination of the data. And I leave out for the discussion now what the Schrems judgment says about government access, because that is indeed something which our courts have decided is part of the analysis and part of the protections that model clauses have to ensure. That is not necessarily something that each and every country has to decide in the same way for its data transfers. But when it comes to the protections that companies have to ensure, the contract gives you the full set of obligations. So you have legal certainty as to what will apply, what you have to comply with. It ensures the rights of individuals. And since these clauses are pre-approved, you can use, you can on that basis transfer data without need for any further authorization or notification of, for example, a supervisory authority. And as I said, I think that aside from legal certainty and the trust that it creates, I think also for the data transfer, it is also cost effective in the sense that it's cheap. And that is, for example, a difference with some other transfer tools, such as certification, which usually require a certification process, which is costly and in particular, therefore, a problem for small and medium-sized companies. So also in that sense, I think model contract clauses are an excellent way to ensure data transfers. You had asked something about what's then the difference depending on who is data exporter and who is data importer. Namely, does it make a difference if both are controllers, or whether one of them is a processor, or if you have a processor sub-processor relationship? Yes, it makes a difference because the responsibilities of controllers and processors are very different. The processor acts on behalf and under the instructions of a controller, and therefore it cannot itself actually determine many of the aspects of the processing. It will be the contract and specific instructions of the controller that determine that. And that is why the model clauses for controller-processor transfers are much more limited when it comes to, let's say, the substantive principles. Mainly, there are rules about data security in there, whereas they are much more elaborate on the, let's say, procedural obligations that the processor has to follow instructions, that it has to cooperate and give assistance to the controller, that the controller has audit rights with respect to the processor and things like this. All of this has to do with the fact that the controller is primarily liable for what happens to the data. It has the primary responsibility, and therefore it needs to have certain tools to ensure that with respect to its processor. So, and that's very different from a controller-controller relationship, where the SECs are much more focused on the various principles, rights, and obligations that you can exercise then also against the data importer. So in that sense, they're quite different. We even have a specific provision in the GDPR on the controller-processor relationship, which specifically also provides for the possibility of model clauses, even in a non-transfer context. When we draft the modernized SECs, we of course have to take into account these legal requirements that are set out in this Article 28 of the GDPR. So yeah, they look different, but for both scenarios and we believe for all the other scenarios that will make up 98-99% of data transfers, one can have model clauses. We're trying to create a modular system where you can sort of, depending on the type of entities involved, you plug in the respective contractual clauses that fit that situation, and we believe this will be a system which is then easy to handle. And as I said, you have already these clauses which you can take off the shelf if you wish, and you don't need to negotiate them with your contractual partner. You don't need a lawyer to do that, and therefore you spare yourself the costs. And it can also be important, of course, if you are in an imbalanced situation when your sort of economic power is maybe not comparable to that of your economic partner, then also model clauses have the advantage that since you don't have to negotiate them, but you also cannot actually negotiate them, you have to take them as they are, and that is good for the party that has less negotiating power. So there's a number of advantages, and I can only encourage the use of standard contractual clauses, and we will be coming out very soon with the draft of the modernized standard contractual clauses, and then we will be happy to send you the link and have any discussion on that if there's an interest.
Thank you very much, Ralph. That was
I'm done, at least from my side. I don't know. I can't hear anybody else.
No. Yeah, I think Mariana is having some trouble with the internet connections. Are you back, Mary? Yes. Yes. Go ahead.
Okay. I'm back. So a question for Luisa. The second part of the question is actually, I think, more relevant because you've already kind of answered the first one. But the thing is, what does the Schrems II ruling represent for Brazil? And what does it represent in terms of litigation specifically?
Thanks, Mari. So we have discussed what would be the effect of the ruling in Brazil or for Brazil. And as we heard previously, the case raised the bar. So we don't have this adequacy decision. And one question is if we will have an adequacy decision, and hopefully we won't have an inadequacy decision and join the US, as Gabriela pointed out. Because when we think about the fundamental right of data protection, we have to look at all the system, all the legal system. It was also pointed out here today. And in this legal system, we have to look for procedural guarantees. We have to look for surveillance rules. And if we don't find proportional rules, necessary rules that are restricted to the reasons of this data access, we will have trouble. And we will have trouble in an international scenario like the one the ruling shows us. And considering we don't have an adequacy decision, and we might not have one, we have all the other options, the other tools in the box, as we heard here today. However, we still, in my opinion, from the case, we still have to look to all the system. We still have to look to the grantees. We still have to look how a fundamental right, which is the data protection, is handled in the whole system. And it's also interesting that we have to consider also the history of the country using this data. So we have a very good start point, which is the recent rule in the Brazilian Supreme Court that data protection is a fundamental and an autonomous right. but we also have to look how in practice we take care of grantees, especially in the context of access of authorities, how our criteria are applied to personal data access within our government, our social security programs, and so on. So one thing I want to say is that in terms of litigation, we'll see a lot of possible cases involving Brazil, because we don't have, or we still don't have, this broader view of a data protection system. We are building this. Data Privacy Brazil initiative is an example of how important it is to bring capacity building to involve data protection culture in Brazil, but we still have a long path to go. And that makes me think that we probably will have cases where the whole system of grantees on personal data will be analyzed and must be considered, including, as I said before, in our future decisions, future policy decisions about data protection. How wants to add a footnote, and of course.
No, I don't want to, because other speakers, they also still want to have their time, but it's just because I have a bit of a impression that there's some slight confusion about the meaning of Schrems II for other countries and our adequacy system and maybe whether you have adequacy as a transfer tool. So I think one needs to distinguish these things. I mean, one thing is whether we will have an adequacy finding of the European Union for Brazil at some point. We haven't assessed this. I don't know. I think Brazil is on a good way in terms of its data protection law and an independent authority and all this, but we have not even received a request to analyze this. But that's also a totally different question from the fact whether Brazil wants to have an adequacy finding as a transfer tool for itself, for data transfers from Brazil to Argentina or another country. So those are totally different questions, and of course also the standard that you would apply to your adequacy finding, it doesn't have to be necessarily our standard for adequacy. Right. So I think one should really make a distinction here, and for Schrems the same thing. I mean, Schrems is first of all relevant for us. It's relevant how we from the EU can transfer data and what we have to take into account, what assessment we have to carry out. But that would of course also apply when at some point we would assess, for example, adequacy for Brazil. That's indeed true. But again, it doesn't mean that this is directly relevant for Brazil. But at the same time, since you have now data protection recognized as a fundamental right in Brazil, and more generally, I think it's always good to think about what are the limitations and safeguards around government access in your country. But that's it's a question that has nothing to do, first of all, in the first place with Schrems II. It's a question of how do you want to protect individuals? How do you strike the balance between an individual right and the legitimate interest of the state for criminal law enforcement or national security? And how do you ensure a balancing of interest? But again, that should be looked at from a Brazilian perspective and not from a perspective of Schrems II. Sorry, it was too long.
Can I sort of add something to that? Because, Ralph, I agree completely with you. And in fact, you're right to make this distinction. But there is always a but. But there is an impact of Schrems II on every third country. And this is because they are the recipients of data from European or global companies who operate in these third countries like Brazil and India and South Africa and China and Russia and the world. And this is the impact of Schrems II, that now every data transfer that is done from EU country to Brazil, to a controller in Brazil or processor in Brazil. I worked for a big outsourcing company that has got huge delivery centers in Brazil, delivering huge outsourcing IT services out to Brazil. So each of these now transfers will have to be looked at through Schrems perspective, because the SCCs that we have got in place have to be strengthened. Additional measures have to be put in place. We have to conduct risk assessment to understand whether the rule of law in Brazil is going to comply with essential equivalency standard of Schrems, and India and South Africa and all of the other countries. And this is what now European companies are facing, that as well as global companies cooperate and Brazilian companies cooperate in Europe. So I think that is the important, for data transfers to Brazil, because Brazil wants to receive data. They want to have this stuff, right? And so they need to somehow enable that. But of course, it is, as you have said, it's the controller or processor or the company in Europe that has got to do that assessment of Brazil law.
No, I totally agree for the transfer from Europe that this is the case, no question. But I just had still the impression that somehow Schrems 2 has become part of the law of Brazil and many other countries.
Right? No, I agree. No.
And that, I think we need to distinguish at least.
And I think this is a very important, by the way, Ralph. This is a great message that you are sending, because I'm saying the same, right? This is European decision. It doesn't mean everybody else has to copy this. We can copy GDPR, everybody else, but they don't need to copy it to that point where they take the governmental access to data into the consideration, because this is really difficult. It puts every country onto collision, right? Conflict of law situation. So for some countries, this may be very difficult to do. In Europe, we will have to deal with this because court has said so, and we will have to do that for the rest of the world, but they don't need to do that. And I'm there with you. And I think it's important that everybody keeps repeating this in Brazil as well, so people don't get the wrong impressions.
But this being said, in my introductory remarks, I still believe it would be a very good thing if we start a discussion at global level as to what would be global standards for government access.
I agree.
A problem in many countries, and I think we need to starting to have a global conversation about this.
I agree with you, and I was one of the group of the advisory board of the group of the experts, OECD, who with Japan and New Zealand and UK has kind of said this. This should be put on the agenda, at least OECD, if nowhere else. So I agree with you, but it may take time to do that, and in the meantime, organizations need to find the way to transfer data today, tomorrow, right? As we have spoken about. It's becoming a very complicated issue. That's why I've said that. And with Brexit, you talked about Brexit. I think this is also very difficult because UK is just in the same position now as the US or South Africa or Brazil might be, potentially. So,
I just want to come back to a local scenario. Of course, Brazil has no direct effect about the Schrems case, but there is a message that the case sends in a global level, and we must think about how our local context evolve, in which direction. And when we are here, we see a lot of initiatives about surveillance and about strengthening these procedural rules that deals with data protection. In fact, we don't have a data protection rule for government access, for example, not a general one. We have them in several rules, including the authorities don't know about them. So there is a huge work on capacity building. And during this capacity building, this is my point, we should take into account how the consequences of the Schrems case could influence our own system. But of course, there is not a direct link. And of course, if we think about data flows with other countries, including, for example, the Mercosur, our own region data flows, we have to settle up different standards or using our own standards. But I think the biggest message from our discussion here is how we have a long path on capacity building to face. I'll just switch it to Portuguese, so people will understand a bit of the discussion. Então, a gente discutiu um pouco os impactos do efeito do caso Schrems, e na verdade, né, não existe um efeito direto, foi algo que o Ralph pediu a palavra e a Boiana e eu concordamos também, não existe um efeito direto do caso, mas existe sim uma mensagem que é feita, né, que é emanada e de forma global sobre o caso. E aí também a gente tem que pensar no nosso contexto local, em como são as iniciativas relacionadas a dados pessoais, para o acesso a autoridades estatais, e daí eu coloquei um pouco das questões, né, de que a gente não tem ainda uma lei geral para essas questões de autoridade, e, enfim, o que foi a maior lição dessa nossa discussão aqui é que a gente ainda tem um grande caminho, né, um caminho bastante desafiador para percorrer, principalmente em termos de capacitação e de educação para uma cultura de privacidade. I think it was that, Bruno and Mari, if you want to.
No, I think we are done. I mean, 2 hours of discussion, and we were honored to have Ralph, Gabriela, Boiana, Luisa, and Renato here. I would like just to conclude and to make some considerations with regards that probably Brazil will not copy and paste the TRIM's decision, of course, and we did not also copy and paste GDPR. We can write thousands of pages to make some, distinctions. Of course, there are similarities, but the particularities of LGPD are very, very relevant. So you think about legitimate interests as a legal basis. The Brazilian data protection law dedicates a specific article just to set up how the balance test would look like. I mean, you don't find this in GDPR, if I'm not wrong. So also, if you take in consideration international data transfer, we don't have here legitimate interest as also one to I'm aware that cannot be repetitive and so on in GDPR, but in Brazil, for instance, we don't have legitimate interest as one of the tools or the, how can I say? Yeah, one of the way to enable international data transfer. So I think it's important to bear this in mind. And one of our goals in Data Privacy Brazil is also to produce this kind of research in English to have this clear. So I would like to thank you again, all of you, for being part of this. It was the first webinar of the series, and we are very, very glad. I mean, it was very worth. I wrote 3 pages here in my book notes to afterwards to make sure that I understand everything. And one important issue, probably we are going to transcript all the webinars in order to also distribute this knowledge as far we can. So thanks, Ralph, Gabriela, Renato, and Luisa for being part of this. Thank you. And pessoal que a gente está acompanhando aqui, a gente se vê na próxima. A gente vai divulgar qual é a programação dessa série de webinários. E, por favor, sigam todos essas pessoas que fizeram parte hoje. Eles são muito ativos no Twitter, né? A Gabriela, o Ralph, a Boiana. Eles compartilharam aqui uma série de materiais que podem ser recursos muito úteis para a gente poder adotar e poder projetar as discussões que irão acontecer aqui no Brasil sobre proteção de dados pessoais. Até a próxima, gente.
Adeus. Many thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ralph.